So as we continue our thinking about the Trinity, this time and next time we're actually going to be tackling one of the most challenging doctrines that there is in Christian thought. And that is the doctrine of divine simplicity. Now, contrary to its name, it is anything but simple, certainly not easy to understand, and it doesn't reduce God in any way. But divine simplicity is actually a technical term that is employed within philosophical theology to try and help us articulate and describe as best we can the plenitude and the abundance and the beauty of the life of God in a way that makes sense as best we can grasp it. So let's unpack this for just a moment and see where it can take us. Divine simplicity is the doctrine that proposes that within God there is no complexity and there is no composition. Now, why is that important? What does that even mean? Well, what it means is that as we consider God's attributes, the plenitude of His perfections, that God is love and that God is justice and that God is power and that God is omnipresent, all of these beautiful attributes that we attribute to God, we can often think that they are distinct qualities within God. So over here is His love, and here's His justice, and here's His power, and here's His wisdom, and there's all these different accumulated but distinct attributes and qualities within God. However, divine simplicity says that no, that's not really how this works. Divine simplicity proposes that within God, God is not a composition of all of these different perfections. There's no complexity. Complexity means that there are components. Human beings have components that make us who we are, all these fascinating bits and pieces that join together to make us humans. Computers have components, thus there is complexity. Within God, however, there can be no complexity. Within God, there can be no composition. Why? Because if there is composition within God, then that means that there is a composer. And if there's a composer, that means that there is somebody or something ulterior to God, something behind God that has caused God or makes God be what God is. And Orthodox Christian doctrine from the very beginning has said, no, that's not the way it is. Right from Irenaeus and the Church Fathers, to Augustine, to Anselm, and most profoundly probably in Thomas Aquinas, the counter-proposal to this is divine simplicity that says, no, God is not an accumulation of perfections and attributes, but rather God is, and this is where divine simplicity gets so hard, because we don't even have the vocabulary to express what God is. But God is, as it were, a singularity. There is a complete and utter union within the personhood and the essence and the nature of God. So here's how this works. It means that if we think that we are encountering God and we're experiencing something of God's love, or we're trying to understand God's justice or God's power, we need to, in order to explain it to each other, articulate it in those different ways. However, when we experience God's love, we're actually experiencing not only God's love, but the fullness of His power and His justice and His goodness and His presence and His wisdom and everything. So everything of God is within all of His attributes, which means that there are no singular attributes that compound or that are composed to make God who He is, but rather God is fully and utterly, completely composed only of the unity of Himself. Now, this is one of the reasons why divine simplicity as a doctrine is completely out of fashion, to be honest. Divinity schools, theological colleges and seminaries very rarely speak about it. Churches basically never speak about it. Even philosophers avoid it. And the reason is because it is so hard for us to even articulate and understand. But I believe it's essential for us to at least try and grasp what this means. Because what it means is that God is utterly transcendent. He is totally other. He is not a combination of things that we can understand. He is actually the totality of something that we cannot understand. But the beauty of this is that God still makes Himself available to be known, but unfortunately only within the inadequacy of our vocabulary and our concepts. So divine simplicity, although out of fashion, I think is a necessary fundamental piece of our understanding to try and grasp who God is and what God is like. that there are not a whole bunch of compounding layers within God that makes him who he is, but rather the totality of God is the fullness of his life. And so whatever we experience of God, we experience his absolute plenitude, the fullness of all that he is. And there's in the next talk we're going to unpack a little bit of the reasons of why that is so important in our lives. Now here's another point that's important for us in this moment, is that when we're discussing these things and when we're trying to grasp them, at the moment you might be thinking, I got no idea what he's talking about, but I'll try and think about it. Is that when we reach the point in our considerations of God, when we sort of bump into the threshold of our mind, of our intellect, of our knowledge, when we're standing on the edge of the abyss of what we can understand, and after that is just pure mystery and white hot bright light, when we're trying to get to that point and our mind starts to buckle to think, I don't understand, I don't get this, that I believe is when we start to worship. That is our best, that is the moment when we are most in touch with reality. Because the truth is that God is utterly beyond our comprehension. He is unfathomable. He is transcendent beyond our ideas, our greatest and grandest imagination and intellect. And so when we reach the threshold of that, that is when we are most truly in touch with reality. Therefore, that's when we are actually most likely to be worshipping, when we are engaging with a God who is not trivial, who is not local, who is not casual, but we are actually encountering and trying to apprehend something of the incomprehensible, the grandness and the beauty and the magnitude of God's excellent and perfect plenitude, which is overwhelming and stuns us into silence. That's why divine simplicity, although impossible for human beings to understand, is essential for us to consider and to meditate upon, because it actually brings us toward God in worship.